Good evening, children. Deadly Headley here, ready to usher you beyond. Dim your lights, turn off your monitors, and say your prayers. What's that I hear in the distance? Teeth chattering? Maybe. Knees knocking? Perhaps. Or could it be perchance? Yes, I think it might be. A death rattle? Well, if you're brave enough to find out, Sir Darkwell Bled will be sure to let you know. If only you're willing to step on beyond. Beyond the rusted gate.
There was no reason, so far as he was concerned, for his car to stop working, and had it not, he would have remained fairly confident it wouldn't. Trenton Jones was by no stretch of the imagination a mechanic. Cars were somewhat of a mystery to him. He knew the basics, the buzzwords, fan belt, combustion engine, and such. He was also fully aware that they needed petrol to run, of which he had half a tank. He could even tell when the car sounded wrong, which his hadn't, all the way up until the point it stopped making any sounds whatsoever. This silence had come accompanied with a complete lack of power and acceleration, forcing him to pull the car to the side of the road. It was night, dark and lonely. Trenton's car had broken down about midway between two towns, if they could even be considered that. Consisting mainly of a couple of small houses and a service station each, these small dots of humanity were not much to look at usually, but at this moment would find themselves welcome sights. Trenton stood in a long stretch of Australian wilderness that, had it not been for the road dividing it down the middle, would have looked much as it had millennia earlier. His eyes, slowly adjusting to the night's darkness, no longer aided by the car's now dull headlights, began to take in his surroundings. There were no streetlights this far in the outback, no houses, no traffic it seemed, and no cell phone towers. Waiting in the car, Trenton felt, would be pointless. The night would not be a cold one, but with sunrise would come extreme heat, and bring with it dehydration. And so, figuring any traveller who would pass his car would eventually come across him down the road also, Trenton resigned himself to the long walk towards town. Setting off in the direction he had already been travelling, he was after all about halfway anyway, and felt some sort of compulsive aversion to trudging several hours back in the direction from which he had just come, Trenton was pleased that his eyes were quickly adjusting to the darkness, helped along by the fact that the full moon, though largely obscured by clouds, was giving off enough light that he could at least make sense of his surroundings. However, the more these surroundings revealed themselves, the clearer it became that there was very little to see. There were no animals, which surprised him, as encountering dingoes, foxes or kangaroos was not just possible, but damn near expected. And as he strained his ears and eyes, he noted that, to his surprise, even smaller nocturnal creatures appeared to be curiously absent from this endless stretch of desert, as, aside from a small breeze and his own footsteps, nothing could be heard in the sands that surrounded him. Or so he thought. Sometimes when you're straining to hear what is not there, it is easy to miss what is, and so it was a long while before, alongside the padding of his own feet and the soft wind blowing, Trenton noticed a third noise. A noise that at first had gone long unnoticed, subconsciously filtered out as an echo to his own actions, but now heard, could not be ignored. Hoping to be proved as such, Trenton immediately stopped his slow march and was disturbed to hear the distant plodding continue. There were, faintly on the desert wind, the sound of additional footsteps. There was, somewhere on this long dark road in the dead of night, another person walking. It was impossible through sheer willpower alone to determine the direction the noise was coming from. Trenton's hearing was just not that astute. However, he reasoned, the soft desert sand would not allow for audible footsteps to carry from beyond his sight, and had the person been behind him, he would have passed them by car or on foot. Therefore, Trenton was fairly certain that the noise must have been coming from in front of him, somewhere further down the road. A deduction that, it would seem, soon revealed itself true, as while the moon moved itself behind less opaque clouds, flooding the long dark road with its eerie blue-grey glow. Far in the distance, trudging along the road just as Trenton was, the silhouette of a man could be seen. Trenton felt this to be an unsettling sight, to see a man alone at night this far in the outback. True, while the same could be said by an observer of Trenton himself, Trenton's presence, he felt, had a logical explanation that this man lacked. If one were to trace back Trenton's trajectory, they would find a broken-down car. The mystery of his presence in the night, so explained, would lose its sense of mystery and fear. This man's being here, however, escaped all explanation for Trenton. After all, there had been no other broken-down car that he had passed since leaving the previous town. No houses, no anything, aside, of course, from the vast desert. Though curious to the man's presence, Trenton was not entirely sure he wanted answers. The distance between them, while not small, was certainly hard to judge. The man's silhouette betrayed no details, but this was likely more due to the poor lighting rather than the distance. And with no familiar objects, trees, or man-made structures lining the road for visual reference, distance appeared to be a vague uncertainty. What was clear, however, was that whatever the distance between them, it was clearly closing. This really should not have been the case. They were, Trenton could tell from the man's echoing footsteps, certainly not outpacing one another. And despite not being certain of perspective, he was sure the man was not shorter than he, not least enough to make any demonstrable difference. Worse yet, having found himself drawing closer and eager to avoid an encounter with the mysterious dark figure in the dead of night, Trenton slowed his pace considerably. And while it seemed the distant man did not do the same, Trenton still found himself drawing closer. It would not do to lose one's head in this of all situations. Surely, Trenton told himself, what he was encountering was some form of optical illusion, a trick of the eye, brought on by the long road, the lack of referential landmarks, and the poor lighting. Further, fearing this man, Trenton reasoned with forced calmness, was as foolish and unwarranted as a stranger fearing him. The man had done nothing aggressive or intimidating, or even to indicate he was aware of Trenton's presence. And as it seemed he had not come from a house or car, may indicate him to be a hiker or bushman, better equipped than Trenton for such situations, and maybe, just maybe, carrying a satellite phone, from which he could use to call for help. Following this reasoning, Trenton decided that having an encounter with the man would more likely have a positive rather than a negative outcome. But just as this conclusion was reached, it seemed the optical illusion had reversed itself, and the dark stranger seemed to be drawing further away. Convinced, perhaps in no small part by exhaustion and desperation, that this stranger was Trenton's best chance to get off this long dark road and into a cheap motel in a timely manner, he began to sprint after the stranger. The irony was not lost on him that having a dark figure run at you in the middle of the night would make him, not the stranger he pursued, the more likely to be mistook for a scary aggressor. But when you place hope in something, it is hard to lose it, and Trenton was not yet ready to lose the dark stranger and his potential aid. Running at full speed, it seemed the distance closed no further, but at the very least did not widen. However, so far as Trenton could tell, the man still walked at his trudging pace, despite drawing no closer. Perhaps another illusion. It was hard to tell, with sweat in his eyes and the moon now rapidly dancing in and out of the clouds, flashing the desert and long dark road with brightness before plunging it into darkness again and again. There was a fraction of a moment where the figure was lit completely, silhouette fully removed, and Trenton thought he saw a man dressed very much as himself, in dark jeans and a grey hoodie pulled over his head. However, following the moon's retreat and a short stint of darkness, the light returned to reveal nothing. No, not nothing. The man was gone, but in the distance, Trenton could see something by the side of the road. A car? A wreckage of a car, rolled on its roof. The wreckage of the man's car? Perhaps. But why would have he walked so far from it only to return? And it didn't seem that the man nor anyone else was with the car now regardless. With every step towards the vehicle, an unsettling conclusion continued to grow within Trenton, at first fought down and ignored, until with the license plate coming into view, it could be ignored no longer. This was Trenton's car. His car had been fine when he left, hadn't it? It wasn't working, but it wasn't on its roof. No, the car had just stopped, Trenton thought. The car had stopped, and he had walked in one direction. He had walked in one direction for what seemed like hours, only to return once more to what seemed like the point of his departure. It seemed to defy explanation, and was far too elaborate to be a prank. Whatever was going on here, he felt sure the figure he had seen had something to do with it. There were footprints heading from near the car to the road. His? The man's? It didn't matter. Trenton pulled his grey hoodie over his head, determined to find answers, and set off after the dark figure in the same direction he had been walking. Always. Later the next morning, a truckie would find the wreckage of a car on the side of the road. The police would be called, and they would determine that one survivor, likely dazed, confused, and possibly in a state of shock, had crawled his way out of the vehicle before standing and walking down the road. Footprints found at the site would confirm this theory. The license would identify the car as belonging to a Trenton Jones, whose body was never found. Trenton never made it into town, but it is said that on a full moon night, if you stop along the same stretch of dark desert road and listen, you can still hear the faint echoes of his footsteps on the wind.